Okay, instead of actually showing just the pages, I'm going to have it blank. If you would rather have me show the pages and not have it blank, then let me know in the comments. One more thing is that I'll make you a deal. If you subscribe to my channel and you leave a comment telling me what the name of your channel is, I'll go to your channel, subscribe to your channel, and leave a comment. Okay? We got a deal. Chapter 9, Simon's Birthday. Daniel soon discovered that when Molly said she had a plan, what she really meant was, I have this kind of general idea of something that should happen, so you go and make it work. Molly Lee was brave. Molly Lee was persistent. Molly Lee was not, however, a detail person. The first part of the plan was secrecy. Daniel didn't like lying to Eric and Rowan, but Molly convinced them that if they found out, Rowan would scold them, and Eric might go so far as to try and stop them. As Molly had said before, those two believed in the rules, and they didn't hold with anyone breaking them. So, after much debate, Daniel and Molly decided that the only members of their little conspiracy would be those who needed to know. The two of them, of course, and Simon. Daniel was surprised by Simon's reaction when they finally clued him in to what they had planned. Far from being grateful for the risk Daniel was about to take, he seemed to resent that Daniel had to be involved at all. He acted as if it were a great inconvenience to have Daniel stay with him on the night before his birthday, and laid down a ridiculous number of rules. Daniel could stay in his room, but he wasn't allowed to touch any of his stuff, that sort of thing. At one point, Daniel was ready to call the whole thing off, until Molly quietly reminded him that they weren't only doing this for Simon, they were doing it for Eric, too. Molly wanted to be involved, but they decided that she needed to keep a safe distance away. She would camp out in a pump tent in the woods next to Simon's house. Her parents thought she was sleeping over at Louisa's. From there, she could keep an eye on Simon's bedroom window without actually putting herself in jeopardy. Or so they hoped. Daniel argued for Molly to stay at her own house, far away from any risk, but Molly stubbornly refused. The pup tent was the best compromise they could come up with. As for Daniel, he was left with the near impossible task of packing. On the afternoon before Simon's 13th birthday, Daniel stood in his room, staring at a pile of junk that had spread out over his bed. After all, what do you pack for guarding a superpowered kid? He decided that overkill was his best bet. 1 flashlight, extra batteries, a 2-liter bottle of soda to help him stay awake, a book of home stories to help him pass the time if nothing happened, a whistle to call for help if something did happen, a bag of beef jerky, a compass, some rope, an instant camera, his magnifying glass, and an extra pair of underwear, just in case. I thought you were going to a sleepover. Where's your friend live? The bottom of a well? Daniel was startled by the thin voice from over his shoulder. When he turned around, he was surprised to see Graham standing in the attic doorway. Graham, aren't you supposed to be in bed? Oh, pshaw, she said, making a face. I'm tired of looking at the same 4 walls all day long. Need to get my blood moving. But Daniel could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the crackle in her lungs that sounded like paper, and he noticed the way she leaned onto his doorframe for support. The simple trip up the stairs had taken every bit of extra strength she had. He quickly brushed his pile of junk aside and made a space for her on his bed. Here, Graham, sit down. Well, don't mind if I do, just while I catch my breath. She sat down heavily on the edge of his bed. It was a slow process, careful and deliberate. These days, she always moved like that, as if she were made of glass in a house full of hard edges. When she'd settled down, she gave a satisfied thump of her cane and gestured to the gear strewn all over Daniel's bed. So, is this what kids do for fun these days? She fingered the coil of rope suspiciously. Planning to tie someone up and force-feed them beef jerky and soda all night long? Daniel smiled, but he could feel a tight ball of guilt winding up in his stomach. He didn't like having to lie to her. Not to Graham. It's just stuff, he said. We were thinking about camping out in Simon's yard. Graham's eyes narrowed as she mulled over this. Well, you be careful then. There's a whole lot of forest out here, and you wouldn't be the first child to be carried off in the middle of the night by rabid raccoons. They grow big in these parts, you know. Daniel laughed. I'll be careful. By the way, I hear you met little Molly Lee from across the street. Such a sweetheart. A real cutie, too, don't you think? At the mention of Molly, the ball in Daniel's stomach did a small, unexpected flip. Why was Graham smiling? She's okay, he said quickly. For a girl, I mean. She's fun to hang out with. Actually, she's more like a boy in a lot of ways. Why was it so stuffy in here? Well, continued Graham, I remember when she was just a chubby little thing, in pigtails and frilly dresses. The poor girl's mother tried for years to dress her like one of those porcelain dolls, but it never looked right on Molly. She dirtied up more beautiful dresses. Apparently, her parents must have just given up. Daniel smiled at the thought of Molly wearing a frilly anything. Can't say I blame him, he said. When Molly gets her mind set on something, that is the end of it. You don't say. And what's she got her mind set on these days? Another stomach jump. Just what was Graham getting at? Nothing. I mean, she's always on about something or other, but it's never a big deal. Girl stuff, you know? Graham nodded and rested her chin on her hands as she twirled her cane between her fingers. Her bent shape was silhouetted against the attic window, and just over her shoulder, Daniel could see the sun drooping low over the trees. In the pink evening glow, she looked as she had before the cancer. Rosy and full of health. I'm glad that you're making friends, Daniel. I know that coming here couldn't have been easy on you. A new town, a new school. There's a lot of grown-up stuff going on here, with my being sick and all. But I don't want you to forget to be a kid, at least for a little while longer. Daniel nodded. This was my room when I was little, she continued, her gaze far away. Did you know that? Oh, sure, this house has been around for a long, long time. Much longer than this, old lady. I remember staring out that window at Mount Noble for what must have been hours at a time. I'd stare at the clouds and the sky and the stars at night. You know, as you get older, the gray matter starts to fail on you, and your memories get all fuzzy. They disappear into mist. I don't remember much of my childhood, but I do remember staring out that window and dreaming. I bet I had wonderful dreams. She reached over and pinched Daniel on the arm. Her eyes looked a little moist, but Daniel couldn't be sure in the fading light. Don't grow up too fast, Daniel. No matter what else happens, promise me that. I promise, Graham, he said. I promise. And he meant it. Later that night, Daniel was forced to sit through an awkward dinner with Simon's family. He basically had to pretend that he and Simon were best buddies, which was nearly impossible to do when Simon was actually around. Throughout the meal, Simon took advantage of every opportunity to make a joke at Daniel's expense. Daniel had never been a fan of pork chops, and when he didn't clean his plate, Simon laughingly accused him of watching his figure for Molly. Daniel wanted to tell Simon to shut his fat little face, but since he was sitting at Simon's dinner table, he was forced to grin and bear it. After dinner, the two boys excused themselves from the table and spent the rest of the evening in Simon's bedroom. Simon was a speed freak, which Daniel thought was ironic considering that he was an even slower runner than Daniel. His only power seemed to be creating those little electric wisps. And he had decorated his room with NASCAR posters, plastic models of sports cars, and there were no books to be found, but plenty of video games, most of which involved racing. Just looking at his room, Daniel was reminded of how little the two of them had in common. They were two members of the same secret club, who otherwise wouldn't give each other the time of day. Still, for one night at least, they were stuck with each other. Simon sat at the foot of his bed and untangled a video game controller from a mass of wires. He started playing some kind of vehicle demolition game, one in which his car seemed to earn points by repeatedly smashing it into an ice cream truck. Daniel watched him play in silence for a few minutes. That your high score? Daniel finally asked, trying to pass the time. Yeah, grunted Simon. So what's the point of the game? Is there some kind of goal, or is it just about wrecking things, or I'm just beating on Mr. Crazy Cream's truck to get enough power-ups to get to the next level, and you're not helping any by talking to me? Well, sorry, but what am I supposed to do all night while you play your game? Not my problem. That was it. Daniel was tired of Simon's smug attitude. If he didn't care about what happened, why should Daniel? They would find some other way to help Eric. You know what? Just forget it. Just forget the whole thing. I'm going home. Who cares? You're not here to help me anyway. It's Eric you're all worried about. Daniel felt a twinge of guilt. He probably should have seen it coming, but the truth was that he had never really considered Simon's feelings about all this. That's not true, said Daniel. Molly is worried about everybody, even you. And what about you? Who are you doing this for? Daniel hesitated for a second before finally caving in. Fine, I'm doing this for Eric and for Molly, but it's not like you've ever even been nice to me. You're pretty much a jerk to everyone. Simon threw his game controller to the ground. That's because you're all such a bunch of losers. With that, Daniel picked up his backpack and headed for the door. This kid was unbelievable. "Happy birthday," he said without turning around. Daniel was just opening the door when a sound caught his attention. A sound he recognized, but just couldn't believe he was hearing. Not from Simon, anyway. He turned and watched as Simon wiped his nose on his sleeve. His face was red and wet with tears. He wasn't just crying, he was bawling. Being scared stinks, he managed between sobs. "Yeah," answered Daniel. "Yeah, it really does." Daniel stood on the threshold for a moment or two, then slowly shut the door again. He put his backpack down on the floor, walked over, and picked up the game controller. "You got another one of these?" he asked.